Hey everyone, today I want to answer a perennial question that comes up in the ICRPG community, whether that's on the forums, the Discord, or wherever people talk about index card RPG. And that's specifically, where are the traps? Now I'm not talking about GM traps. I mean, Runehammer already has a great video talking about trap theory and how to use that as a GM, but what I'm talking about are player traps. Traps that players get to use in their game. Now this comes up because as you look at building characters, you come across one of the character types, the Hunter, which is an awesome character type. I've got the player's guide here, and when you look at it, you've got the starting abilities, like Quick Draw and Deadeye. Both of those make sense. But then you get the Trap Expert. And it says, your traps damage all victims near the trap when tripped. And I mean, that sounds awesome. It's a pretty simple ability. I think it sounds great. But you immediately follow up with that question of, where are the traps? Like, what traps are you talking about? You start looking through the starting loot, you get to Trap Launcher with this spring-loaded gadget, roll a ranged attack to place a trap anywhere you can see. Again, sounds awesome. You're building a hunter that has these traps, and you immediately picture tripwires and bear traps and catching people and setting off bombs and all sorts of, it just is a fun idea for a character. You immediately like, what can I do with it? Well, you look in the basic equipment list, nothing. You look in the loot table list, nothing. You look in the GM's guide, nothing. Like, there's no real list or comprehensive guide to player usable traps in Master Edition or in Second Edition or wherever. And that's okay. That's okay. Because as a GM, you start to wonder, like, where are the traps? But then also, how do you handle trap experts? Because these players have cool ideas for their character, and you want to support them in their idea of what they want to do. I've had these. I've had characters and players who want to be trap experts. So with some thinking and over the years of trying it out and with the various players, I've come up with kind of 3 different approaches that I want to talk about. Because just like a lot of things in ICRPG, it isn't about having everything listed out to you in the system or in the book. What ICRPG does really well is provide you a list of tools that can enable you to answer all of these questions and enable all of the different use cases that may come up as you work with your players and you set up your games. So let's talk about the tools and how I would go about creating and handling trap experts. Okay. And so the very first thing that I would want to think about is whether or not you want to treat your traps as an ability. That's kind of like option number 1. Treat it like an ability. As soon as they take Trap Expert, they now have that option as a trap, to set traps or to use traps in their game. And then how you'd kind of go about using those abilities is, it's kind of like a free-form approach, where because it's an ability, you need to look to your player and talk with one another to kind of decide, how do you want to use this? What are you thinking about in this scenario? Like in this particular case, you want to set up a tripwire across this little hallway? Okay, describe what you're thinking, and then let's see what we need to do. And this is where you're going to be able to use checks. Those classic just rolls, doesn't need to be dexterity, doesn't need to be wisdom, doesn't need to be strength, whatever. Based off the player's description, use checks or attempts, aka hearts of effort, to enable what the players want to do. So let's use the case of the tripwire across the hallway, right? If they're just wanting to set up the wire, you may just say, hey, roll a dex check and see if you can set it up quickly enough before they turn the corner and it's there. Or if it's like, no, I want to wire a string of like a spider web across the hallway, and so when they run into it, they get caught, but maybe they get cut a little bit, or they're going to get stuck and they're going to slam into each other and it's going to turn into kind of like a net or whatever. That's going to be a heart of effort. So maybe it's a 1 heart of effort, or maybe it's 2 hearts of effort, depending on what it is. But there's really no limit to what they're using, and I also don't have to track components. I don't have to track uses. I just allow my player to treat it like an ability, and we roll dice and effort for it. And that's standard ICRPG. It's nothing new. So that's option number 1, and it's worked well. I've had it before. It works great. It just doesn't necessarily give you a lot of control or crunch over exactly what the players are building and using, but it does allow a much more free-form approach and allows you to enable players' imaginations, which is awesome. The second option is to treat it like an item. This is, again, another classic way of handling things in ICRPG, where just like a lot of loot, your loot gives you items, or it gives you powers, it gives you abilities, it enables you to do certain things beyond just normal checks. So you can treat traps like an item. This is kind of like a grocery shopping approach. But if you know that your player is going to be a trapper, you can develop a list of items that they could then swap out for their basic equipment if it's a new character, or you can have this in a shop or something that they can barter for. So if you generate a small list of items that enable you, like the very specific items that give specific functions, you can allow players to take that and fill their inventory, and then that also allows you to kind of threaten those items that could be lost or destroyed as they use them. So let's take a step away from the tripwire and let's go to something more classic like a bear trap. So you could develop a trap item that's a bear trap, right? You design it specifically to say you can, with a strength check, place this in an area, and then as enemies, get close to it, it will trap them, deal basic damage or weapon damage, and it will lock them in place for D4 rounds. That's a very specific item. It has a very specific function, and it can fill up an inventory, and players can have that in their space, and then they can place it, and then that item may be lost because they place it and then they run, and now they've lost that item, but they've used it and it's been able to enable their escape, or it gets destroyed, like the enemies start hacking at it and maybe deal a heart of damage, and they get out before it's the D4 rounds are up, or something happens and they break a trap. And so this enables them to just treat this just like any other item, have it in your loot list, drop them in the game, give them options to get new ones, and then you can continually develop new items as time goes on. So give them at the start of the campaign, at the start of like with the player when they create it, give them 5 options, and then as time goes on, if you have new ideas or the player has new ideas, add another 5, and then over time you're eventually going to have a list of traps that you can then reuse in future games with future players. It's a really great part of developing that kind of homebrew list for you, and you understand how these items work. So classic, use traps like an item. Now the last option which I've done, which is treat it like a consumable. Now a consumable is very similar to an item, except they have limited uses. That's the difference between just like a standard item and a consumable. And for me, this option is a much more controlled approach. It allows you to design those items with limited uses, just inherently, and it allows you to you can go more extreme, but you need to have an option for the players to refill them. So let me describe the difference between there. So rather than a bear trap, you have poison bottles, like vials of poison, and you want to be able to throw these out as bombs or smoke gas or poison gas or whatever. What this allows you to do is you can then have a variety of these consumables, treat them, design them like items, very specific use case, very specific, function. You can be a little bit more vague because you can go a little bit more extreme with them, rather than because you know that they're only going to be used once, twice, 3 times. It's really up to you. So, for example, I can say, here is a pouch of poison gas vials. You've got 4 of them. So you can use them 4 times to fill an area with poisonous gas. And as enemies come through them, they have to make a con save, or they take, basic damage for 4 rounds. So it's a much more extreme case. I could even say they don't even make a con roll. It's just an automatic 4 damage every, for 4 rounds, or whatever you want to do. But once they're used, they're gone. So players get to have this kind of conundrum of, when do you use this trap? How do you set it? When do you do it? And you can be much more liberal with throwing these out. And you're much more controlled, because you really control the flow of when they get them, when they can refill them. But this is where you do need to have an idea of, when can you refill them? When can you enable them to get more? Because whatever approach or option you take with traps or how you handle trap experts, because of what they're doing and that they're tied into these items or these traps. If you go with the consumable option or even the item option, you need to make sure that as their kind of options are being used up, they're still a valuable and functional member of the team. Like a mage or a cleric has magic, and they can keep using magic for the start of the adventure and the end of the adventure because they either still have those options or whatever. But if you're using consumables and all of a sudden they get to the last scene and they're completely out, while a really fun moment for a moment to say, I have nothing, if those characters don't have functional, abilities otherwise in that, it really kind of makes them null and void. So being aware of need to refill, filling them in, giving them options to kind of keep them going is something to be aware of. And that's something that I've found as I've run trappers in my games. But enough said for that. I just think that when you're designing traps or you have players that want to be trap experts, don't overcomplicate it. Try to just think about how would you handle this using the basic tools that ICRPG provides, because that is going to give you a much more streamlined and simple experience than trying to develop something unique and custom just for traps. Abilities, items, consumable, all classic elements of ICRPG and can really enable you to run trappers and trap experts in a streamlined way that works well with the rest of the team and how they play. But what do you think? Let me know how you've handled traps in the comments below. I'd love to hear your trap ideas, especially what kind of traps have your players come up with, how have you run them, and what kind of lists or things would you do if a player wants to be a trap expert.